In 1823, a mountain man with a torn-open chest did not have a doctor. He packed his bleeding ribs with raw bear grease and dirt. Modern survivalists have no idea how brutal frontier medicine actually was. These solitary men trapped beavers and hunted grizzly bears hundreds of miles away from the nearest human settlements. A simple broken leg or a deep animal bite was an absolute death sentence without extreme medical intervention. They survived by turning the wild, brutal landscape into a crude, violent hospital, using whatever nature provided. Today, we are going to explore the darkest and most desperate corners of human survival history. We will uncover the harsh organic remedies that saved men who were completely cut off from the civilized world. Let us count down the 25 rugged survival medicines mountain men actually used to stay alive. Number 25 is sphagnum bog moss. When a solitary mountain man suffered a deep axe wound to his leg, he did not have soft cotton bandages or a clean hospital bed waiting for him. He would frantically drag his bleeding body to the nearest cold wetland and harvest massive handfuls of thick green sphagnum moss from the muddy water. He packed this damp, earthy vegetation directly into his wide-open gash to absorb the rapidly pooling blood and protect the exposed muscle fibers. This primitive wilderness tactic sounds like an absolutely guaranteed way to catch a fatal bacterial infection in the dirty, wild environment. But modern scientists now know that this specific moss naturally contains heavy amounts of iodine and possesses incredible organic antibacterial properties. It absorbed up to 20 times its own weight in human blood and kept the horrific wound perfectly sterile during the long healing process. Hundreds of violently bleeding trappers survived their lonely expeditions solely because this miraculous aquatic plant grew near the freezing riverbanks. Number 24 is raw black gunpowder. When a deep puncture wound began to rot, the smell of death followed the trapper through the dense, lonely woods. To stop the spreading gangrene from reaching his heart, a man would empty a paper cartridge of black powder directly into his infected flesh. He would strike a piece of flint and intentionally ignite the explosive powder inside his own living body. The sudden, violent explosion of intense heat instantly vaporized the rotting tissue and killed the deep bacterial infection. It left a horrific black crater of charred meat, but it successfully stopped the poison from destroying his entire limb. The pain was so absolute and terrifying that grown men would often lose consciousness the exact moment the powder sparked. It was a hellish medical procedure that traded a single moment of supreme agony for a few more years of life. Number 23 is boiling pine pitch. Mountain men moving constantly through dense, dark forests often suffered terrible lacerations from jagged, broken branches and sudden animal attacks. They would harvest the thick, sticky resin from pine trees and melt it down in a tin cup over a roaring campfire. While the liquid was still dangerously hot, they poured the boiling pitch directly over their open, bleeding cuts. The boiling tree sap essentially glued the torn human flesh together, acting as a primitive set of waterproof surgical stitches. As it slowly cooled and hardened, it created an impenetrable shell that kept dirt and hungry insects entirely out of the fragile bloodstream. Pine sap also contains powerful natural antiseptic compounds that actively fought off dangerous fungal infections common in the damp wilderness. A trapper could walk for endless weeks with a hard black armor of tree sap safely sealing his broken skin. Number 22 is raw, rendered bear grease. When you live in a brutal climate that regularly drops to 30 degrees below zero, your skin cracks and bleeds constantly. Mountain men hunted heavy black bears and rendered their thick winter fat into a heavy oil that they carried in small leather pouches. They smeared this thick-smelling grease entirely over their bodies to completely waterproof their skin and insulate against the lethal freezing cold. But this heavy grease was also a primary medical treatment for severe dry burns and frozen, decaying extremities. When rubbed deeply into completely frostbitten fingers, it provided a dense barrier that allowed the damaged human tissue to slowly heal. It trapped the natural internal body heat and prevented the dead layers of skin from peeling away entirely and exposing the bone. Bear grease smelled completely atrocious, but it was the undisputed king of frontier skin medicine for over a century. Number 21 is boiling human urine. Finding clean water in the wild was incredibly difficult because stagnant ponds were often contaminated with unseen parasites that would destroy an open wound. If a mountain man desperately needed to wash out a deep laceration, he could absolutely not trust the dirty water from a local swamp. He would urinate into a tin cup and boil the fluid aggressively over his campfire to create a completely sterile medical wash. Urine is naturally sterile when it leaves the human body, and it contains heavy ammonia, which acts as a mild, powerful cleaning agent. Boiling it over the fire ensured that any stray environmental bacteria were completely eliminated before the liquid ever touched the exposed muscle. Pouring hot urine over an open wound was humiliating and absolutely disgusting by our modern civilized sanitary standards. But when you are bleeding out, entirely alone on the side of a frozen mountain, personal dignity is the very first thing you abandon. Here is the first pattern break of our journey. You must closely understand that survival in the absolute wilderness strips away every single layer of fragile human vanity. These mountain men were not romantic, beautiful heroes riding cleanly through a cinematic landscape in a Hollywood movie. They were filthy, desperate humans, fighting a brutal daily war against apex predators, terrible weather, and their own fragile biology. When a deep infection sets into a wound out in the wild, the human body begins a terrifying countdown to inevitable death. There were absolutely no rescue helicopters, and absolutely no warm hospitals waiting to save a foolish traveler from his mistakes. If you could not find a cure buried in the dirt or growing on the trees, you simply died screaming under the open sky. They eagerly embraced disgusting and violent remedies because the only other alternative was becoming free food for the starving wolves. Number 20 is the fresh animal skin wrap. Severe burns from exploding campfires or misfired rifles left solitary men with massive areas of exposed, agonizing nerve endings. A traveling companion would immediately shoot a deer or a wolf and skin the dead animal as incredibly fast as possible. They wrapped the bleeding raw side of the fresh, heavy hide directly against the burned, ruined human flesh. The inner biological membrane of the animal skin was perfectly sterile and contained natural cooling fluids that instantly soothed the agonizing burn. As the heavy animal hide slowly dried in the sun, it contracted violently and formed a tight, protective cast around the damaged limb. This crude biological bandage kept the dirty air off the exposed human nerves, which immediately dropped the unbearable pain levels. Men survived third-degree burns completely alone in the woods solely because they stole the skin of a dead animal to replace their own. Number 19 is crushed campfire charcoal powder. Eating spoiled, preserved meat or drinking tainted river water was a constant deadly threat for solitary trappers traveling across the vast continent. Severe dysentery and violent food poisoning could quickly dehydrate a massive, strong man and kill him in less than 48 hours. When the severe stomach cramps began, a trapper would frantically grind cold campfire charcoal into a fine, black, powdery dust. He heavily mixed this gritty black powder with a small amount of dirty water and forced himself to swallow the foul, thick sludge. The activated carbon inside the burnt wood acted exactly like a magnetic sponge inside his completely ruined digestive tract. It bound itself tightly to the toxic bacteria and heavy environmental poisons, allowing the human body to safely pass them. It blackened their teeth and tasted entirely like dead ash, but it stopped the fatal dehydration of wilderness dysentery completely. Number 18 is deep snow packing. Severe frostbite and deep gangrene frequently required a desperate man to cut off his own dying toes or fingers to save his life. Without any alcohol or chemical anesthetics, the pure pain of cutting entirely through your own living bone was absolutely unimaginable. To prepare for this brutal, solitary surgery, they would bury the dying limb deep in a frozen snowbank for several continuous hours. The extreme freezing temperature completely deadened the human nerves and temporarily halted the heavy flow of red blood. Once the flesh was completely frozen solid and white, the trapper would take his heavy hunting knife and strike the bone. The thick ice acted as a natural numbing anesthetic, allowing him to complete the butchery before the screaming nerves woke up. It was a cold, calculated use of the hostile freezing environment to facilitate a horrific but entirely necessary surgery. Number 17 is raw beaver castoreum. Trappers spent their entire harsh lives hunting beavers for their highly valuable pelts, but the wild animal provided far more than just warm fur. Deep inside the beaver are specific castor sacs, which contain a heavy, pungent musk used by the animal for marking natural territory. The mountain men quickly learned from native tribes that this foul-smelling biological paste was a miraculous natural wilderness painkiller. Beavers naturally consume massive amounts of willow tree bark, which makes their thick castoreum incredibly rich in raw salicylic acid. When a solitary trapper suffered from a crushed broken bone or a severe burning fever, he would eat a small spoonful of this raw gland paste. It worked exactly like a massive concentrated dose of liquid aspirin, completely shutting down inflammation and dulling extreme physical pain. They basically harvested modern medical chemistry directly from the internal bleeding organs of the wild animals they were hunting. Number 16 is the yarrow weed styptic. A tiny, careless slip of a sharp skinning knife could easily sever a major human artery in the wrist or the leg. To prevent completely bleeding to death, a mountain man would frantically search the surrounding brush for the tall white flowers of the yarrow plant. He aggressively crushed the feathery green leaves between his dirty hands and packed the thick green paste tightly into his bleeding wound. Yarrow is a highly powerful natural styptic, which means it chemically forces open blood vessels to constrict and clot almost immediately. The exact moment the raw plant juices touched the torn human artery, the violent bleeding would slow down to a highly manageable trickle. Ancient historical legends actually state that the warrior Achilles used this exact wild plant to treat his bleeding soldiers during the Trojan War. The desperate mountain men did not care about ancient myths. They only cared that the bitter weed kept their warm blood inside their bodies. Number 15 is wild spruce needle tea. Spending 6 brutal months trapped in a snowy mountain pass meant surviving entirely on dried, tough meat and dense animal fat. This absolute complete lack of fresh green vegetation caused the human gums to rot, the teeth to fall out, and the skin to heavily bruise. Scurvy was the silent, terrifying ghost that slowly killed more isolated trappers than grizzly bears or hostile warriors ever did. To actively fight this terrifying physical decay, they aggressively boiled the sharp green needles of wild spruce trees into a pale, bitter tea. Spruce needles naturally contain massive, heavy amounts of vitamin C, which immediately reverse the devastating biological effects of the scurvy. Drinking a hot cup of this piney, bitter liquid every single day kept their human connective tissues from physically dissolving into nothing. It was a completely simple wilderness brew that successfully held the fragile human body together through the darkest, freezing winters. Number 14 is live maggot debridement. When a terrible hunting accident left a man with a shattered open leg, the human flesh would often begin to deeply putrefy. A lone trapper could not surgically remove all the dead, rotting tissue with his crude, unwashed hunting knife. He would intentionally expose the dark, rotting wound to wild blowflies and patiently allow them to lay their eggs directly inside his flesh. Within a few short days, hundreds of hungry, wriggling maggots would hatch and begin aggressively eating the dead, necrotic meat. These blind insects completely ignored the healthy, living human tissue and only consumed the black, rotting poison that threatened the man. They also secreted a powerful biological enzyme that actively fought off secondary bacterial infections while they thoroughly cleaned the deep wound. After the busy bugs finished their incredibly disgusting meal, the trapper washed them out and safely bandaged the fresh pink skin. Number 13 is wet drawing clay. Sudden rattlesnake bites and toxic spider venom were a daily terrifying hazard for men walking heavily through the tall prairie grass. If a man was struck violently by a venomous snake, he had only a few short minutes to remove the poison before his nervous system collapsed. He would quickly slice the bite marks wide open with his knife and pack wet river clay tightly into the bleeding holes. As the thick, heavy clay slowly dried in the hot sun, it contracted violently and created a powerful natural physical suction effect. This mechanical pulling action aggressively drew the venomized blood out of the surrounding tissues and safely trapped it in the dry dirt. It was a desperate race against time, performed with hands shaking heavily from extreme adrenaline and pure terror. If the wet clay dried fast enough, the sweating trapper lived long enough to see another beautiful sunrise in the mountains. Here is the second pattern break of our journey into the wild. When you closely listen to these rugged survival tactics, you begin to deeply realize how incredibly fragile we have become as a species. We often panic if we get a minor paper cut or a small wooden splinter while walking barefoot in our completely clean homes. These solitary men walked entirely into the absolute unknown, armed with nothing but a rifle and a savage determination to simply survive. They did not ever view nature as a beautiful, peaceful sanctuary meant for relaxing weekend camping trips or pleasant hikes. Nature was a massive, active predator that was constantly trying to freeze them, starve them, or deeply infect their fragile bodies. Their vast medical knowledge was not based on fancy university degrees, but on the bloody, brutal trial and error of dead friends. They fully learned to respect the wilderness because the wilderness absolutely never forgives a single careless human mistake. Number 12 is heated river rocks. Falling heavily through the thin ice of a frozen winter river was a total death sentence if a man could not raise his core temperature immediately. Building a massive fire was completely not enough because the outside skin would burn, while the internal human organs continued to slowly freeze. Desperate companions would pull smooth, round rocks from the freezing riverbed and heat them in the roaring flames until they were dangerously hot. They quickly wrapped these scorching heavy stones in thick animal furs and placed them directly against the frozen man under his armpits and in his groin. The intense, violent heat completely bypassed the outer skin and traveled straight into the major arteries of the failing human body. This violent influx of massive thermal energy shocked the human heart and forced warm blood back into the dying extremities. It often left severe, permanent burn scars on the outer skin, but it successfully resurrected dead men from the absolute edge of hypothermia. Number 11 is raw willow bark. Terrible fevers in the deep, isolated mountains could cause violent, terrifying hallucinations and dangerous physical weakness. A man who was entirely too weak to hunt would quickly and quietly starve to death inside his own lonely, freezing shelter. Desperate trappers would heavily strip the inner bark from wild willow trees and furiously chew the bitter, fibrous wood for endless hours. The wet bark naturally released heavy chemical doses of salicin, which cooled the boiling blood and broke the terrifying fever dreams. It was the exact same chemical biological mechanism that modern doctors use when they prescribe synthetic aspirin to sick hospitalized patients. The isolated mountain men did not understand the advanced chemistry, but they deeply understood the immediate physical relief it provided. They gnawed heavily on raw tree bark, exactly like wild animals, just to maintain enough human sanity to keep their fire burning. Number 10 is heavy salt packing. Coarse salt was an incredibly precious commodity used to preserve heavy beaver pelts and dead deer meat for the long journey back east. But when a trapper suffered a massive open flesh wound, salt immediately became the most brutal, painful medicine in his entire pack. He would pour massive, heavy handfuls of raw, coarse salt directly into his bleeding laceration and bind it extremely tightly with a leather strap. The pure pain of raw, burning salt touching exposed human muscle fibers is so intense that it causes involuntary violent vomiting and fainting. But the heavy salt completely sucked all the living moisture out of the wound, making it entirely impossible for deadly bacteria to survive and multiply. It aggressively preserved the living human flesh exactly the same brutal way it preserved the dead animal meat. It was an agonizing, horrific procedure that proved these hardened men feared deadly infection far more than they feared temporary, excruciating pain. Number 9 is slippery elm paste. Sometimes a starving mountain man would accidentally swallow a sharp piece of shattered animal bone while eating his crude meals in the absolute dark. The jagged bone would violently tear the human throat and stomach lining, causing severe internal bleeding and horrific abdominal agony. He would desperately harvest the inner bark of the slippery elm tree and aggressively mix it with river water to create a thick, heavy gel. When finally swallowed, this slick biological slime heavily coated the torn esophagus and created a thick protective bandage directly inside the human stomach. It physically shielded the open internal wounds from harsh natural digestive acids, allowing the dangerous internal bleeding to finally stop entirely. The thick tree gel also absorbed dangerous toxins in the human gut and provided a small amount of easily digested emergency nutrition. It was an absolutely ingenious way to medically bandage an internal injury that could never be reached by human hands. Number 8 is wild garlic packing. A deep, vicious bite from an angry bear or a starving wolf introduces incredibly lethal bacteria directly into the fragile human bloodstream. When a tough trapper initially survived an animal mauling, the subsequent infection was usually what actually killed him, a miserable week later. He would frantically dig up wild garlic bulbs, crush them with a heavy rock, and stuff the pungent paste deep into his open puncture wounds. Wild garlic naturally contains allicin, which is absolutely one of the most powerful broad-spectrum natural antibiotics found anywhere on Earth. The sharp chemical burn of the raw garlic entirely destroyed the animal bacteria and stimulated heavy, warm blood flow to the dying tissue. The entire camp would deeply smell like a foul, rotting kitchen, but the highly aggressive natural treatment saved countless completely severed limbs. It was the absolute poor man version of penicillin, actively deployed decades before actual antibiotics were ever officially discovered by modern science. Number 7 is the tobacco juice rinse. Every solitary mountain man safely carried a heavy twist of dark chewing tobacco in his leather pouch for the long, lonely, quiet nights. When a terrible eye infection or a severe spreading skin rash severely threatened to blind or cripple a man, tobacco instantly became his pharmacy. He would aggressively chew the heavy dark leaves and spit the dark toxic juice directly into his infected eye or open bleeding wound. The heavy natural nicotine and harsh chemical additives in the crude, unrefined tobacco acted as a completely vicious local biological antiseptic. It deeply burned, exactly like pure acid, but it ruthlessly killed off the surface parasites and massive bacterial blooms attacking his human flesh. Washing a fragile human eyeball with dirty brown spit defies every single sensible rule of modern medical hygiene and basic sanitation. But in a brutal world, completely without clean water or clear eye drops, you eagerly use the toxins in your pocket to fight the toxins in your body. Number 6 is the raw meat poultice. When a wild horse aggressively kicked a man, or a falling heavy tree violently crushed his shoulder, the deep tissue bruising was completely debilitating. The trapped internal bleeding would immediately swell to massive proportions, and the trapped physical heat would cause immense, radiating agony. A desperate trapper would cut a thick, wet, heavy slab of fresh, raw meat from a newly killed animal and tie it securely over the bruise. The cold, dense animal muscle absorbed the radiating, heavy heat of the severe inflammation much better than a simple wet, dirty rag. As the raw meat slowly warmed and dried, it physically drew the stagnant blood and deep swelling completely out of the human tissue. It looked completely barbaric for a strong man to walk around with bloody deer flesh tied tightly to his own broken body, but it heavily reduced the swelling fast enough for him to pick up his rifle and continue the brutal hunt the very next morning. Here is the third pattern break of our intense journey. Completely consider the absolute silence and utter terrifying isolation of a man treating his own horrific injuries in the deep wilderness. There is absolutely no one to kindly hold his hand, no one to offer sweet words of comfort, and no one to hear him scream. He constantly has to stare directly into his own torn flesh and make the brutal, calculated decision to inflict more pain upon himself. This extreme level of radical self-reliance is almost entirely impossible for a modern, civilized human brain to ever fully comprehend today. We completely outsource our healing to trained professionals, but these men absolutely had to be the surgeon, the nurse, and the screaming patient all at once. Their daily survival required a cold, calculated mental detachment from their own immense physical human suffering. They completely viewed their bodies as simple biological machines that needed to be patched up by any incredibly violent natural means necessary. Number 5 is biting ant head sutures. A long, deep slash completely across the human chest or stomach could not simply be wrapped in a bandage. It absolutely had to be physically closed. Entirely without a tiny needle and clean thread, a wounded mountain man would aggressively search the forest floor for large, biting ants. He would tightly pinch the bleeding edges of his torn skin together and physically force the angry ant to bite directly across the open wound. The exact moment the powerful insect jaws locked the skin tightly together, the trapper would twist the body of the insect completely off. The tiny, decapitated head remained permanently locked in place, acting exactly as a perfect biological staple holding the human flesh closed. He would deeply repeat this horrific process 10 or 20 agonizing times until the entire bleeding laceration was completely sealed shut. It was a terrifying testament to human biological ingenuity, heavily using angry insects as crude surgical tools in the middle of nowhere. Number 4 is old man beard lichen. High in the incredibly cold, damp mountains, a pale green, stringy lichen heavily grows, hanging from the branches of massive dead trees. Native tribes safely taught the trappers that this strange, fuzzy growth was incredibly powerful medicine for severe lung infections and deep, festering wounds. The wild lichen contains eosnic acid, which is a highly potent agent against the exact deadly bacteria that actively cause deadly gangrene and tuberculosis. An incredibly sick mountain man would aggressively pack this dry, stringy moss directly into his deep chest wounds, or fiercely boil it into a bitter medicinal tea. The pale green threads successfully acted as a slow biological release antibiotic system, continuously fighting off deep infection as the painful days passed. It weighed absolutely nothing, making it the totally perfect medical supply to constantly carry in a crowded, heavy leather backpack. It was a silent, green, organic doctor waiting patiently in the high, cold branches for a wounded, desperate man to simply reach up and grab it. Number 3 is balsam fir glue. A deep, bloody cut across the sensitive knuckles or joints of the human hand is almost impossible to keep closed because the skin constantly moves. Mountain men would aggressively pop the small liquid blisters found directly on the bark of wild balsam fir trees to gently harvest the clear, sticky sap. They heavily smeared this completely transparent, thick resin totally over the bending joints of their severely injured fingers. The heavy balsam resin quickly dried into a highly flexible, waterproof biological barrier that perfectly moved with the human skin without ever cracking or peeling. It highly effectively sealed out the dirty soil and river water while completely allowing the trapper to maintain a firm grip on his heavy hunting knife. This amazing sticky fluid also naturally possessed a sharp, clean odor that actively repelled dirty flies and hungry maggots from landing on the fresh blood. It was the absolute ultimate invisible wilderness bandage, perfectly designed for a strong man who could absolutely not afford to stop using his hands. Number 2 is heavy spiderweb packing. This extremely ancient remedy was widely shared across many violent frontiers, but the tough mountain men utilized it in the darkest, dampest caves and hollow trees. When a sudden, violent animal ambush left a man bleeding heavily, he would frantically tear down the thick, dirty cobwebs built by massive forest spiders. He immediately jammed these dense, sticky webs extremely deep into the open, bleeding cavities of his own ruined body. The microscopic organic threads of the dark web provided a massive surface area that aggressively forced the human blood cells to rapidly coagulate and completely clot. Despite being heavily covered in ancient dust and dead bugs, the webs were incredibly rich in natural fungal spores that actively prevented lethal infections. It was an act of absolute pure desperation, shoving massive handfuls of dirt and insect webs into a clean, open wound. But that deeply desperate, dirty action instantly stopped the heavy hemorrhaging and successfully kept the human heart pumping warm blood. Number 1 is the fire and knife amputation. This is the absolute ultimate historical expression of rugged wilderness survival and the most terrifying medical procedure a solitary human can endure alone. When a heavy limb was severely crushed beneath a falling boulder or mangled by a steel bear trap, it immediately became a dead anchor, dragging the man toward death. To completely survive, the terrified mountain man had to take his own heavy hunting knife and deliberately sever his own ruined flesh and bone. He would aggressively heat his heavy steel blade in the roaring campfire until it glowed bright red hot, using the burning metal to cut through the muscle and sear the veins simultaneously. He would strike the hot blade with a heavy rock to entirely snap the bone, severing his physical connection to his own dead limb. He absolutely did this while entirely conscious, heavily breathing the thick smoke of his own burning flesh in the absolute terrifying silence of the dark woods. This was the absolute ultimate medicine, violently sacrificing a small piece of the human body to completely save the entirety of the human soul. Here is my absolute final challenge to you. The very next time you carefully apply a clean, sterile plastic bandage to an incredibly tiny scratch on your finger, heavily think about the mountain men. Deeply think about the solitary man furiously packing dirty spiderwebs and boiling tree sap into a torn, open chest wound just to see tomorrow. Completely think about the raw, terrifying human willpower it truly took to survive in a brutal, wild world that actively wanted to kill you every single day. These historically isolated men were absolutely not magical superheroes. They were just entirely ordinary humans pushed to the absolute extreme edge of biological endurance. They completely prove that the fragile human body is vastly more resilient than our extremely comfortable modern society ever wants us to truly believe. Hit that heavy subscribe button and deeply tell me in the comments exactly which of these brutal wilderness remedies shocked you the absolute most. Let us completely remember the rugged, tough ghosts of the deep mountains, because their heavy blood and their sacrifices built the incredibly soft world we live in.